Welcome to the European Centre for International Political Economy and a very special debate on the geopolitics of trade and what path for Mercosur. We still have participants coming in today. I know there are many of you. My name is Emily Rees and I am Senior Fellow here at ECIPE and lead for this brand new project focusing on EU-Mercosur relations. Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay share long-lasting ties with the European Union and after 20 years concluded an association agreement. Considering this, at ECIPE, we decided to launch the EU-Mercosur project that will include a series of events, economic research, articles, and much more. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter to keep appraised of all our initiatives. With this project, we'll be diving into numerous themes that impact relations between the two regions, from digital innovation to agriculture, supply chain diversification to environmental protection, biodiversity, and climate change. Throughout this series, we aim to bring fresh voices and updated data to demystify preconceptions about Mercosur and create a platform for honest and informed conversations. We are thrilled to see so many of you join us for this launch event from across the European Union, Mercosur countries, and beyond. And I am particularly excited to introduce you to our three exceptional guests who are spanning multiple time zones to join us today. First, Tatiana Prazeres, who is joining us from Beijing, where she is a senior fellow at the University of International Business and Economics, where she teaches international trade. Tatiana served as a senior advisor to WTO Director General Roberto Azevedo between 2013 and 2018. And prior to that was the youngest ever Secretary of Trade of Brazil and recognized by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. If you do happen to read Portuguese, I can only recommend Tatiana's weekly column on China for the Folha de São Paulo. Next, allow me to introduce you to Renata Amaral, who also holds a PhD in international trade and who not only is a practicing international trade lawyer, but is also a professor at American University, Washington College of Law, where she focuses on US trade policy and the WTO. Renata is also the founder of Women Inside Trade, a network of over 200 female trade professionals from Brazil, and has been tireless in her efforts to close the gender gap in trade policy. And last, but certainly not least, it is an honor to count on the participation of Miguel Brown, former Vice Minister of Finance and Secretary of Commerce of Argentina from 2015 to 2019. Miguel is a public policy economist who currently is invested in Harvard University's Growth Lab. Miguel has played a leading role in his country's international negotiations, be it with the International Monetary Fund, revamping competition policy, and of course, in the EU-Mercosur trade negotiations. So welcome to you all. If you would like to ask a question to any of our speakers, please pop it into the chat function at any time, and we will make sure to get to as many of them as possible in the second part of this debate. Now, to kick off, we wanted to discuss the geopolitics of trade. In recent years, we've been observing quite extraordinary shifts in international trade policy. Particularly, the emergence of China as a global actor is resetting the international scene, and we've observed heightened tensions between the US and China, but also to a certain degree between the US and the EU, which continue to permeate today despite the change of administration in Washington. Here in Brussels, this has led the EU to put forward a strategy focusing on open strategic autonomy that reflects the European Union's desire to chart its own more assertive course on the global stage and diversify trading partners to build supply chain resilience. So as we observe a new triangular relationship between the EU, the US, and China, we wanted to ask ourselves, what about Mercosur in all of this? As mentioned, the EU and Mercosur recently closed negotiations on an association agreement that includes, amongst others, an ambitious trade pillar, with ratification that is still to kick off. This comes at a moment when China has overtaken the EU as Mercosur's first trading partner. This is why we're so happy to count on Tatiana, direct from Beijing. Good evening, Tatiana. You last week presented a report with David Boll and Pepe Chung for the Atlantic Council that presented 4 scenarios for trade between Latin America and China by 2035. So I wanted to ask you, what is the probable scenario here? And how does Mercosur fit into this wider trend? And what impact would a ratification of the agreement with the European Union have on these projections?
Good. Well, thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you today among friends. But I wanted to congratulate you, Emily, for this brilliant initiative to discuss Mercosur EU trade relations, Mercosur EU agreement, etc. And again, Renata, Miguel, a pleasure to be with you. I think it's an interesting starting point, right? Talking about Mercosur and the EU, but then what about China and how that relates to this and how that fits in, basically. So yeah, indeed, we launched this report last week, and we ran different scenarios based on economic modeling. Running scenarios is not about predicting the future, so that's an important caveat. But I'll tell you how I see trade evolving over the next 15 years or so, trade between LAC and China. We anticipate that China will further increase its market share in LAC trade. So in 2000, China had less than 2% of LAC trade. And we anticipate they will have around a quarter of LAC trade by 2035. A quarter is not dramatic, but if you see the trajectory, that's quite impressive, right? We also anticipate that increase would be driven mostly by higher imports from LAC, rather than higher exports from LAC to China. But overall, we expect China LAC trade to increase, to reach unprecedented levels, and that can be at the expense of trade with traditional partners, including the EU, the US, and even intra-regional trade, right? We expect that by 2035, China and the US will be competing for the position of LAC top trading position, a position that has been held historically by the US, of course. Like aggregate figures, I think they hide some important discrepancies across the region, that must be said. But overall, we see China gaining ground across the region. That's what we expect to see. And I think it's maybe it's a good occasion to raise the importance of the EU-Mercosur agreement for our EU partners, because the longer it takes to produce effects, I think the more difficult it will be for the EU to retain its market share in LAC, or even to increase its participation in LAC trade. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. I mean, so we really have a confirmation of this trend. And I mean, turning to you, Miguel, I mean, in the 90s, Argentina's trade with China was marginal. And now that China has become the country's first trading partner out of Mercosur, mostly, again, at the expense of the EU and the US. So, but there is a feeling that even with China increasing its trade presence, the EU and the US continue to exert a geopolitical influence over in Argentina. Is that a correct assertion?
Hi, Emily, thanks. And thanks for the invitation. This is a great panel you've put together. Definitely, Argentina is rooted in the traditions of democracy, human rights, international free trade, etc., that is associated typically with Europe and the US. So yes, I mean, clearly there is a strong influence there, but unfortunately, I think that influence is becoming weaker. And I would say Argentina's situation is not unlike Australia's conceptually, in the sense that Australia is clearly a geopolitical partner of the US and Europe, but its economic interest lies in Asia, and very strongly. I mean, and a great part of the success of the Australian economy over the past 40 years has had to do with its ability to manage this tension. It has stayed firmly in the camp of institutions associated and traditions associated with the US and Europe, but at the same time, its economics have been strongly led by its relationship with China and other Asian countries. Argentina should do something similar. I mean, ideally, it should be able to manage this tension. Clearly, the economic complementarity between Argentina and China is very strong. Argentina is a strong producer of agricultural products and of course some industrial products, but the complementarity with China is very strong. So there's a huge economic opportunity there. But unfortunately, it seems that Argentina is getting both of these challenges not as right as it could, let's say. I don't want to say wrong, but okay, let's say it's getting it wrong. We're closing the economy. For example, this week, the government announced it was prohibiting beef exports, and this is one of the exports that has grown significantly to China over the past few years. So we're missing out on a huge economic opportunity there. And at the same time, the Argentine government is mishandling its relationships with Europe, with the US, etc., on issues such as trade and its relationship in other international institutions. So I think there's a big challenge there, and I think that Argentina should really be looking at Australia as much as possible. And I think that working with its Mercosur partners to ratify the EU-Mercosur deal would be a way forward in this way. And frankly, I think we should expect much more leadership from Europe in ratifying this agreement, because what is at stake is not only an economic benefit for Europe, which is obvious, and all the models that the European Commission has done have shown that there is a concrete economic benefit for Europe, but there's also a geopolitical strategic reason, which is to bring Mercosur, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay firmly into the camp of countries that respect human rights, democracy, and free international trade. So I think that this is an opportunity to show strategic geopolitical leadership and ratify the agreement.
Thank you. So we're really seeing that, I think one of the things that I'm hearing from both of you is that the LAC region really isn't monolithic, right? And that Mercosur, by its geographical positioning and historical ties, is, an Atlantic partner and still is an Atlantic partner, but could soon, let's say, have a pivot to the Pacific, which is what we've seen, let's say, from the western side of South America. Turning to you, Renata, I mean, there's been obviously a change in administration in the US. You're in Washington. Thank you for joining us so early this morning. How is the Biden administration looking at these change in dynamics in Latin America? And is there any appreciation of the need to engage Mercosur countries more from the trade front, but not only?
Well, Emily, thank you so much for inviting me to be here among friends and among professionals I deeply admire. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to initiate my day with you guys. So let me just tell a little bit how Biden handles Latin America. He knows Latin America very well. Unlike Trump administration, Biden has traveled to the region 16 times as vice president under the Obama administration. Only to Brazil, he traveled 4 times. And reportedly, he had a warm relationship with President Dilma, even after revelations on US spying, etc. So with the change of administration this year in Washington, the agenda that the US is likely to prioritize in its relationship with Latin America has some familiar elements like migration, rule of law, governance, counter narcotics, and the crisis in Venezuela, of course. But it has also newer elements to this, to the traditional elements that the US is concerned about. And one of them, of course, is the inroads made by China and the social and economic impact of the COVID pandemic, of course. So these are all serious issues, but they reflect a largely reactive response to developments in the region, right? So the opportunity also exists for a positive paradigm shift in the hemispheric relations post-pandemic that places US, Latin America ties in a more, let's say, strategic footing to respond to current challenges. But the big issue is China. So how to respond to China's increasing investment and trade with the region, like Tatiana just mentioned in her remarks. So while Latin America's reliance on China is less than sometimes suggested, the fact is the debate in the region of the dangers of over-dependence on China could be sharpened, right? So the region, however, other parts of the world, like other parts of the world, is not looking to choose between China and the US, and we mentioned that before here, but it might be open to dialogue. So President Biden's challenge to European allies, for example, at the Vitro, we had the Munich Security Conference in February, right? They agree on a common approach to China, and this could also be repeated and made at the Summit of the Americas that the US is hosting later this year. I think that finally the concept of reviving hemispheric trade talks should also be on the table, right? But it's not a priority to Biden right now, as we all know. And with regards to Mercosur, and if there is an appreciation to the need to engage more with a bloc, as a bloc, I don't know, we saw the special assistant to the president, Juan Gonzalez. He went to visit some countries in Latin America. He visited Colombia, he visited Argentina, he visited Uruguay, he didn't visit Mercosur, Brazil, I'm sorry. So my understanding is that there is willing to negotiate bilaterally more than as a bloc, and I think this is very clear. I also just before finalizing this, my first remarks, I think we have to remember that also with Brazil, Trump administration had signed the new protocol on trade rules, right, and transparency, including anti-corruption, trade facilitation, and good regulatory practices. This all this combo is in Brazil, in the Brazilian Congress now to be approved. It doesn't need to go through Congress in the US. So it's my belief that there is a willing to negotiate more bilaterally than with Mercosur as a bloc.
And we'll get to that specific point in a minute. But so what I'm hearing here is a couple of things, is that essentially China's rise in the LAC region will come at the expense of the US and EU's market share. And perhaps now it's going to become a competition between the US and the EU in that region to retain market share. Renata, you just said that the US is going to look to engage more bilaterally, but surely that doesn't allow you to eliminate tariffs or reduce tariffs in the way that an agreement such as the EU-Mercosur Agreement has already sort of been secured, right? Another takeaway that I'm hearing here is that perhaps if just on that point, Renata, so the US is looking to negotiate bilaterally, so we're looking at more regulatory deals. Is that it, rather than tariffs?
I think you mentioned an important point that is now being discussed. As you know, Uruguay just recently made a statement that it would like to negotiate, right, alone without Mercosur. I don't think that will concretize easily, to be honest. I think, especially Argentina, and Miguel could correct me, but Argentina needs Mercosur, and I don't think Argentina is going with Uruguay, for example, in that decision of negotiating alone. I think what we might see in the near future, because of the political orientation of the governments, Brazil as well, is that we might have some waivers to negotiate specific agreements without Mercosur. So specific waivers for specific situations, but I don't believe that the bloc is dismantling right away. You know, we have one thing just to finalize here, Emily. I think it's important that one discussion in Mercosur, it's a problem in Mercosur, is the common external tariff, and there is a proposal right now of Brazil to reduce it by 20%. So this is a big discussion, but I don't think that's the main problem within the bloc, because within the bloc we have other problems on more related to non-tariff barriers to trade than to tariff barriers to trade. So, did I answer?
So for our audience here in Europe, who might not have followed the latest innuendos on the Mercosur side, let's take a moment to look at that in a bit more detail. So here in the European Union, just so that you guys are aware, we are very often guilty of projecting our own understanding of an integration process, which is our own, that of the European Union, when we consider a customs union as Mercosur. But the setup is really different, isn't it? And we saw that during the trade negotiations with the EU. Here in Europe, the European Commission negotiates on behalf of all the member states, right? But they were negotiating de facto with 4 countries at the same time during these negotiations, and not a single entity, for instance, negotiating on Mercosur's behalf. So when the agreement in principle was reached in June 2019, many commentators spoke basically that we had reached an alignment of the stars, right, between the Mercosur countries in order to seal that deal. And yet, as you make mention, 6 months later, after finalizing a process of 20 years in the making, there was a change of government in both Brazil and Argentina. And the feeling was perhaps that the stars weren't aligned in the region anymore. Moving forward, the pandemic hits, and in April 2021, Argentina announced that it was suspending participation in all trade negotiations of Mercosur, and took, to a certain degree, the other countries by surprise. After some tug and throw, Buenos Aires, which is where Miguel's joining us today, reaffirmed its commitment to ratifying the agreements with the EU and I believe EFTA, but basically remained opposed to pursuing any other negotiation. And in that pipeline, there were some big ones, such as Canada and South Korea. So Miguel, first, could you perhaps give us a bit of information, explanations on what the rationale was behind this decision? Because it's not an easy one to understand, and where the prioritization of the EU agreement came in after that big announcement.
Mm-hmm. So the new government in Argentina is clearly one with protectionist tendencies, inward-looking tendencies, and one that prioritizes domestic politics over long-term international agreements. And what I think happened in this episode is that they put a microphone in front of the person who's in charge of the negotiations, and he said the first thing that came to mind, which was pretty honest, which is, we don't want to move forward with these negotiations. Then I imagine that a savvy diplomat explained that, you can continue being at the table. These are long processes. It doesn't mean that your economy is going to be open in 5 minutes, and that the best strategy is just to sit at the table, but drag your feet. And I think that that's what they went for. They said, no, we're going to continue negotiating. We're in favor of EU-Mercosur, blah, blah. But in practice, they are not doing anything proactive to ratify. And in fact, I would say they're doing everything in their power to, make things as slow as possible. Here, I think that there's a serious challenge if now I look at the issue from a European perspective. Once again, and it comes down to the issue of leadership. I mean, the pandemic, I think, has shown and has really brought home the concept that challenges in the world today are global in nature. And when we look at issues such as, let's say, terrorism, money laundering, migration, these are really global phenomena and that thrive when you have countries that have weak institutions. And really, it's in the interest of the European Union to have stronger partners and countries with stronger institutions. And trade deals are an excellent way to strengthen institutions. And now, here you have a region where you see challenges flaring up all over the place. In Argentina, we have a government that is run by a coalition in which one part clearly wants to be aligned with more authoritarian governments such as Venezuela, Russia, Iran, etc. You have challenges in places that seemed very stable, such as Chile and Colombia. So really, I mean, I think it's almost a no-brainer in terms of strategy to say, hey, here's a deal where we're going to make money out of this deal. And on top of that, we're going to contribute to institutional stability in a region that is very relevant for many of the challenges that we were talking about. So I think that it's very, very important for, as you said, to sort of place the debate on EU-Mercosur ratification in a more relevant place in the European discussion and to bring in a more nuanced and more strategic view and not just a trade view.
May I just pick up on one of the points that you just made there, Miguel? You mentioned that trade deals are opportunities to strengthen institutions, which is not always how we look at a trade deal. Could you elaborate perhaps on that? And I'd like to hear if Renato and Tatiana agree on that.
Yeah, but, I mean, very quickly, I mean, trade deals, as you know, have many, many chapters, and these chapters include basically issues on standards for sanitary and phytosanitary rules, technical rules, etc. And all this implies, investment protection, etc. And all this implies modifying domestic legislation and bringing it up to international best practices. And this is a huge change for some of these countries. I mean, one of my jobs as Secretary of Commerce in Argentina was product market regulation and competition policy. And ratifying the EU-Mercosur agreement would have brought modernization to many of these areas, and this is a concrete, specific improvement in the institutional setup of a country. So I think it's really, really important. And the effect that this has is that it strengthens incentives to invest. And when you look at the impact of trade deals with the European Union, with Chile, Mexico, Morocco, Egypt, the main change in these countries after ratification was an exponential growth in investment. So that's what really Mercosur takes out of the deal. Not so much a short-term trade benefit as the EU does. I mean, the EU gets a stronger trade benefit from the deal, but Mercosur gets this sort of institutional improvement that leads to stronger investment and long-term growth.
May I ask Tatiana, I see you, please.
Well, you were asking me if I agreed with, if I would agree with Miguel, and I would say, yeah, absolutely. I'll just add that there's also the component of legal certainty that is brought by such agreements. So you lock in certain commitments, and that prevents participants from moving backwards, right? And this legal stability, legal certainty favors investments, etc., and also protects these commitments from political changes in countries, not only on one side of the Atlantic, but also on the other, and that is very positive. So I just add that element to what Miguel said. But since I'm speaking, let me just echo his words on the importance of leadership on the EU and Mercosur members of championing this agreement, championing the ratification process and moving ahead, not only from a commercial perspective, but also from a broader political angle as well.
Renata, what's your view?
Yeah, if I may just add, I completely agree with Miguel and Tatiana. And I think one thing that, for example, in the Mercosur EU agreement, from where I see it, for example, the environment commitments that are in the agreement would help actually Mercosur countries to modify their standards, right, and to observe. And I think that's really important because I think this is the decade of environment, right, and trade and environment. So I think Mercosur needs actually a push to be aligned with the international standards on this. Also, one thing that was crossing my mind when I was listening to Miguel and Tatiana is, for example, the protocol that Brazil signed with the US on good regulatory practices, on anti-corruption, on trade facilitation as well. These are all commitments that the Brazil and the US have made, but it are commitments that are going to be also replicated to other trade partners, right? So I think especially for Brazil, the commitments that were made on good regulatory practices and on anti-corruption, they have a political impact also, and also the benefits that this bilateral relationship will gain from this are also going to be replicated to other trade partners.
So just picking up on that point, Renata, you're basically mentioning this protocol between the US and Brazil on the good regulatory practices. How do you ensure that Brazil keeps with its commitments? Because that's often something that we hear in European audiences where there's a concern at that level. Do you think that these commitments which have been signed with the US will go forward?
I believe so. I think there is a willing from both sides. I think one thing that's important to remember, Emily, is that presidents and governments, administrations change, but the technical staff is there working. And for example, I'll give you a very practical situation. The Trump administration changed, went away, Biden came, but the technical staff between Brazil and the US, they kept working on the protocol, on everything that was signed last year. So I think it's always important to have this in mind, that there is a technical staff, and then Tatiana or Miguel can assure this better than me. They were Secretary of Trade, but the technical work, it's in another level. It's different than the political level. And I think there is a commitment, a serious commitment, and I know actually from Brazil that there is a commitment and there is a willing to implement the good regulatory practice or anti-corruption commitments, because this will benefit the country in other levels, right? For example, the OECD, right? These are all commitments that will favor the Brazilian acceptance at the OECD. So I think it's different. It's important to differentiate the political level and the technical level. And I think it's very serious on the Brazilian side and on the other Mercosur country sides as well.
Well, on that point, Miguel was responsible for looking at Argentina's accession to the OECD and that whole candidature process. So do you agree with Renata's assessment?
Yes, pretty much. I don't think I have much to add there. I think she was very, very clear, and I agree. Yeah.
Okay, so moving to another big hot topic of 2021, we can't talk about the geopolitics of trade today without taking a moment to reflect on the handling of the pandemic, export restrictions, and vaccine diplomacy. Mercosur countries, as everybody knows, have been quite hard hit by COVID-19 and adopted very divergent tactics regarding trade policy. So at the early stage of the pandemic, Mercosur countries each adopted a mix of trade policies, including both liberalizing and restricting measures, such as temporary elimination of import tariffs, or export restrictions also on certain personal protective equipment and medical devices such as respirators. However, when it comes to vaccines, things do get a lot trickier, right? And in many respects, they still are. Mercosur is a region of 260 million citizens, and nearly 500,000 have passed now as a result of COVID-19. So we have a big debate here in Europe over questions relating to vaccine production and exports and export authorizations and the wider dynamics of vaccine in vaccine questions such as the TRIPS waiver in the WTO or even the diplomatic aspects. So what we've seen over the last 18 months is that, well, or less than that, since vaccines have started going into production, is that the vaccines produced in the European Union have hardly trickled into the region. The US, and Renata, please correct me, has been applying a de facto ban or export ban on its vaccines. So China, once again, coming back to China, stepped in. And delivered 144 million doses. The Financial Times reported, I think it was yesterday. More than half the jabs injected to date in that region come from China. So I'd like to get your take on China's vaccine diplomacy in the region, but also coming back to this EU-US influence over Mercosur. How will this be considered from that aspect, from the Mercosur side? Maybe passing first to Tatiana.
Okay, good. Thanks. Well, there's so much I wanted to comment on previous remarks, but let me just focus on this issue of pandemic now. So I think, and let me focus on Brazil again. It's very hard to generalize the region, but I think Brazil's dependence on Chinese vaccines and pharmaceutical ingredients coming from China, I think they have helped tone down the anti-China rhetoric in Brazil. The issue is that in Brazil, China has become part of the internal political debate. So it's becoming a matter of internal politics in Brazil. And that renders the relationship very unpredictable, very unpredictable. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Quickly on LAC, I think many don't realize that, but LAC is a region that concentrates a disproportionate number of countries that maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan, right? So out of the 14 countries that recognize Taiwan worldwide, 9 are in the region. And importantly, Paraguay doesn't have diplomatic ties with Beijing. So I think, well, Paraguay is suffering a lot from COVID, and it has little options to access vaccines, really. So I think the discussion about switching diplomatic relations in Paraguay has reemerged, unsurprisingly. Nothing may happen immediately, but I think it's a point to flag here when it comes to China's relations with Mercosur countries that, well, many people are not aware of.
And that's really a fascinating one. I mean, the question, this support of Paraguay for Taiwan is a very long-standing historical stance, right? And it's often one that you're correct to bring it up, is one that we're not really aware of. So do you think that particular recognition or non-recognition of the diplomatic ties on the Taiwan-China front can have an impact internally within the Mercosur countries, or do you think that they all treat their relationship to China independently one of another?
I think they treat it independently, But as China's presence in LAC increases and in Mercosur increases, this issue will emerge, and there'll be a point in time where trying to isolate the commercial component from the broader relationship will be increasingly difficult. So we need to see how that evolves.
So may I come back perhaps to Renata on vaccine diplomacy and how that's been perceived in the region, keeping in mind the US administration's stance to date. I mean, the Biden administration announced this morning, if I'm not incorrect, or maybe it was last night for you, a willingness to become the arsenal of vaccines for the rest of the world. Yet they haven't really exported any vaccines to date. How do you see that sort of playing out?
It's interesting, right, Emily, because I think the US, since the statement of Ambassador Catherine Tai on the beginning of the month, supporting the waiver at the WTO, is I think it's pretty much a political move, because as you might imagine, the pharmaceutical industry and the medical devices industry in the US is not really supporting the waiver. But I think what they did at the WTO is pretty much a way to get some leverage to negotiate domestically, actually, on the vaccines issue, right? You might remember that on October last year, we had a proposal from India and South Africa, right, for a waiver that included patents, industrial designs, copyright, protection of undisclosed information, and included like medical products, vaccines, medical devices, medicaments. The waiver proposed by the US this month is different. It's a waiver on patents for vaccines, for COVID vaccines. It's reduced, right? So I think I don't think that the text on a waiver will be is the ultimate goal here. I think it could immediately increase the government, and it did, right? It increased the government leverage over vaccine markets, and I think it increased the domestic leverage to negotiate with the pharmaceutical industry. But I don't think that there is a real willingness to really waive copyright patents, especially patents, right? But I think what the US is trying to do is to pressure the pharmaceutical industry to do more licensing of production to factories in developing countries. That's something that could be negotiated, but I don't see the US, well, Biden said this week that he will export 80 million doses. We will see what's going to happen. Honestly, here it's kind of ridiculous because we go to pharmacies, to any CVS here, there is a sign saying, here you can get vaccinated with Johnson, with Moderna, with Pfizer. So we have a lot of vaccines like here that could be exported indeed. But I think all the movements until this moment are more political than really a willingness to take part in this vaccine diplomacy as China did, exporting spread to several countries. So I don't know, I think we need to see what's happening, but they need to negotiate domestically first.
Miguel, do you have any comments? I mean, Argentina has been more on, let's say, a closer position to the US, and we've seen Brazil take a closer stance to that of the current position of the EU on this. And I'm just going to invite everybody to send in your questions. We're already receiving many of them, and we'll be passing, we'll get into the Q&A in a second. Miguel?
Yeah, let me make two comments, Emily. First, on the politics and on vaccine diplomacy. Clearly, in Latin America, I would say that China and Russia won the sprint. I mean, they were faster. They had less, let's say, institutional checks and balances to unroll the vaccines fast. In fact, Argentina, I think, was one of the first countries to use the Russian vaccine. And thankfully, it's been very successful. I mean, we had no serious drawbacks, and it seems to work. So that's a good thing. But I think this is a marathon, right? I mean, of course, the political impact of vaccines is huge. At least polls in Argentina show that people who have been vaccinated tend to be much more positive in their view of the government. So this is a very important thing for Latin American governments in this fragile political, volatile political environment. But it's a marathon. And I think that the EU and the US have an opportunity once they, finish vaccinating their own populations and have an excess supply and manage to generate global supply chains for this, to really win the long game, right? And because this COVID is going to be an ongoing issue clearly, and I think there's a huge opportunity there. So I think the game isn't over yet. And the second comment I would say is on the industrial organization of the pharmaceutical industry and the institutional arrangements in a country. Argentina has a very strong pharmaceutical sector, as people involved in the EU-Mercosur deal are probably aware of. And this potentially was a huge win. For example, we were one of the first countries to participate in trials of the Pfizer vaccine. And we had the opportunity of having an early supply of millions of Pfizer vaccines. We are part of the sort of global supply chain of the AstraZeneca vaccine with a local laboratory partnering up with a Mexican laboratory. And then there's another laboratory now who's going to start producing the Sputnik vaccine. So that's a win. That's a positive thing, and countries having strong industrial organization in the pharmaceutical sector is a good thing. But, and here's the big but, in a context of weak institutions, the result was underwhelming compared to what it could have been, because we, in the end, for reasons of the negotiation and the contracts, etc., we didn't get the Pfizer doses. The AstraZeneca doses seem to have been delayed. So really, I think that it's the complement between having a strong industrial base and strong institutions is very, very important. And I think that countries should be looking at strengthening both of these things.
Thank you. And so when we're talking about industrial strategy, I'm going to open up here now to some of the questions that we're receiving, many of them coming in. And the first one that we have here is about standards. So we've been discussing the China, EU, US, let's say, relation to the region. And we have a question here asking whether these different approaches, how are these different approaches to standards and to sustainability going to be reconciled in these countries? So is it a winner takes all kind of approach that will happen? Maybe if I can pass that on to Tatiana, what do you think will happen here when we're looking at the standards that will be uptaken in the region?
I couldn't hear you, Emily. You cut. The line was cutting. I'm sorry.
So in terms of standards, if we're going to be looking at standards, and we have three big players now coming into the region, we have China taking a dominant position, but we also have the US and the EU very clearly, wanting to keep a market share. And we have this trade agreement that does, as we've said, project standards. It also projects regulations to the region. How do you see the reconciliation on the question of standards happening in the region, and particularly as relates to safety and sustainability? This is the question we have for Peter van Dijk.
Okay. Well, listen, it's a big question, and I think these agreements help not only to increase, the protection of public goods, but also lock in these commitments and prevent countries from rolling back. And I think reconciliation is not something that I find particularly hard. I think the spirit of this of protecting certain common goods is such that, the higher you can go, the better, or the more appropriate for the countries in a particular moment in time, the better. But I think the challenge is really to be able to agree to certain high-level standards, commit and observe them. So I don't see that as a reconciliation as problematic. I think it's more a matter of internal agreement within Mercosur about how far they are willing to go and are willing to commit. And as we know, political cycles, different political cycles within Mercosur have prevented Mercosur from moving ahead as fast or as ambitiously as we would have liked.
Thank you, Tatiana. Maybe I have a question here from Miguel, and this is coming from Igor Sigisian from the OPP. And he'd like to know, should the EU not ratify this trade agreement or the association agreement with Mercosur, how would the geopolitical and trade strategy of Mercosur countries be impacted by that? And what would be the credibility of the European Union as a trade and political partner in Latin America?
Well, on the first part, I think that, as we mentioned at the start of the talk, there is a strong pull from China, right? And clearly the economic complementarity between Mercosur and China is very, very strong. The incentives on the ground, let's say the pressure from companies are to increase trade with China. So I think that there's going to be a strong challenge there. Basically, this and it's going, but I think it's going to generate a huge problem for Mercosur, because Brazil and Uruguay, especially, the current governments want to open their economies. They want to increase free trade agreements, lower the common external tariff. And I think that all of the Mercosur countries have found in the EU-Mercosur trade deal a good compromise in which the economy is open, but they do it in a predictable and let's say slow way, which allows all of especially the strong industrial complexes in Argentina and Brazil to adapt to opening the economy. If that mechanism disappears, then I think there's going to be stronger tensions within the bloc, where some countries, as I said, I think mainly Brazil and Uruguay are going to want to push for more openness, and Argentina is going to want to maintain the status quo. So I think it's going to be a big challenge if it isn't ratified.
So effectively, this agreement could act as a cementing system, maybe for Mercosur as a bloc, right? If I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it forces us also to upgrade the internal agreements that we have. For instance, the automobile sector is not part of Mercosur, and of course, our Brazilian counterparts always said, "Look, guys, I mean, we can't be negotiating a trade deal that includes the auto sector with the EU and not have a deal amongst us. That's ridiculous. We can't have a public procurement agreement with the EU and not have one amongst us." So the negotiation with the EU triggered a lot of improvements within the Mercosur region itself. We actually signed a public procurement agreement, an investment deal, and other things. So it has a very, very positive impact.
Talking about positive impacts, we have many questions about sustainability in the environment, and I just need to say to all our guests that we will have a special event just to deal with this issue, the topic of deforestation, environmental protection, biodiversity, and climate change at a later date to be announced. But we'll take a couple of these questions that are coming in. A lot of them relate to the question of enforcement and the fact that, for instance, we have Daniel here from the Amazon Observatory on Trade and Environment who wants to know, Renata, how can the trade and sustainable development elements of this deal be upheld if with no enforcement mechanisms, is what Daniel is saying. That will obviously be disputed by others in terms of how strong those mechanisms are. And relating to that question, I will throw you another one, as we have Oscar Guinea, my colleague here at ECIPE, who would like to know that whether the dialogues that have been included into this agreement, so there are a number of dialogues on animal welfare, on agriculture, on food safety, that they perhaps aren't strong enough in terms of the enforcement mechanisms to actually have an impact or have a positive role. So what are your thoughts on that, Renata?
Thank you, Emily. Just to add to Miguel's comment, I think the sugar sector is also not within Mercosur, right? And I remember this was a big issue on the negotiations of the agreement. So we have actually two sectors that are outside. And also, I think maybe picking up on Miguel's comments, I think the enforcement issue is a problem. And I relate that with the gender aspects of the trade agreements that are not enforceable as well. But I think with regards to Mercosur and EU, I think there is more to do with the interest of the Mercosur countries in updating their standards, their commitments within the environment. They need to do it because, as I mentioned at some point, this is the decade of the trade and environment. I think everything will have to do with the environment, and especially Brazil. I think we need updates, serious updates on the domestically and internationally. For example, our carbon market targets, nothing's decided yet, and we have the conference at the end of the year, the UN conference. But what I think is that the agreement with the EU specifically gives opportunity to Mercosur countries to review their own commitments domestically, separately, and as a bloc. And I think that is needed. I know the question of the enforcement is always there, but honestly, I believe that if Mercosur countries, and especially Brazil, do not follow the wave now, the environment wave now, honestly, we are gonna lose. We are gonna be the biggest losers, so.
Miguel, Tatiana, any final thoughts following Renata's analysis there as we close?
Let me just, well, maybe not on that in particular, since it's final remarks, let me just get back to some previous comments made by both Miguel and Renata about the strategic value of the Mercosur EU agreement and the need for EU, or the importance, I mean, for the Europeans to decide, but I think of the importance for the EU to think strategically when it comes to its agreement with Mercosur. As Renata has hinted that maybe the Biden administration is not really interested in going for a free trade agreement with Mercosur. Well, if the Mercosur EU agreement doesn't go much further, well, we've heard, for example, Uruguay may be interested or floating the idea of, oh, what about China? And we saw the Chinese ambassador in Montevideo saying, well, maybe we would be open. Well, something like that. I don't want to misquote him, but we would be open, to working with Uruguay or Mercosur as a bloc bilaterally, or the region as a bloc. Listen, I think it is important for everyone to take a step back, look at the bigger picture. Like it or not, there is a geopolitical there's a geopolitical issue at stake here. It's not only about the commercial gains, about global politics as well. It's about geopolitical interests. It's about how the Europeans see Latin America and see Mercosur in particular in the decades to come. So I'll say there. Thank you.
Yeah, just a closing comment on the environmental issue. I would say the same thing I said regarding the strategic value of the agreement. I mean, it's much better to have the agreement. The agreement already has some standards, and the leverage that the EU will have in Brazil and in Mercosur in general on environmental issues will be much larger if we have the agreement than if we don't. So I think that really sort of hijacking not kidnapping the agreement to sort of add more things to it now is probably not a good idea. I think the best strategy would be to, to ratify the agreement. We have an agreement. It took 20 years to negotiate. Let's just get it done. And then you can have further negotiations down the road. I mean, the EU has updated many of its trade agreements. That's a normal thing. It can be done. And frankly, I think that the best thing to do would be to just move forward with the ratification. So.
Thank you. I mean, we could obviously debate these topics for many hours, but we're reaching our time. So I wanted to thank you and to everyone who sent in questions and engaged with us on social media. We can keep the debate going there. And a big thank you, merci, gracias, and obrigada to our exceptional speakers for joining us throughout multiple time zones today. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the great team at ECIPE for all the hard work in making this webinar possible. And we look forward to seeing you for a new debate very soon. As mentioned, as part of the EU-Mercosur project, we'll be hosting a wide range of conversations. We'll have time to get into all of the nitty-gritties to better bridge understandings between the two regions. And we look forward to having you there. Thank you.